Okay, we've been studying about various ascendant kings of both Israel and Judah. Last week, well, our stories are contained in both Kings and Chronicles in the Bible. They tell two different sides of the same stories. One gives more detail on one story, one more detail on another. Last week, Jehu killed the king of Israel, that was Ahab's son. He killed Jezebel, and he killed Ahaziah, who was the king of Judah. Ahaziah was the grandson of Ahab. His mother was named Athaliah, and she was Jezebel's daughter. Well, when she found out her son was dead, she did what I hope no other woman does. She ordered the death of all of her son's children. She wanted to take the throne to herself. And they killed all of Ahaziah's children, all his sons. They're dead. This is a problem because God promised that David would be the ancestor of the Messiah. Well, this is David's descendants were just killed. Except Ahaziah had a sister. I assume she was a half-sister, that she wasn't Athaliah's daughter, but had the same father as Ahaziah. And she was married to the priest Jehoiada, which is a fun name to say, so if you need to say a fun name, Jehoiada. She found out what Athaliah was doing. She was able to get one of Ahaziah's sons and his nurse hidden safely in a spare bedroom and then smuggled out to the temple. So one of Ahaziah's sons was not murdered by Athaliah. For 7 years, Athaliah ruled Judah. And then the priest Jehoiada said, it's time, we got to fix this mess. So he called the army commanders and he had them go throughout Judah and gather up all of the heads of clans, all the army officials, everybody important. He brought them to Jerusalem. He told the army guard, when you have the changing of the guard, you know, part of you are on shift and then you go off shift and the other part comes on. So when we have that changing of the guard, I want the ones who are coming on to your shift to stand guard around the palace and around the temple. And I want the half that is going off duty to surround the altar and other parts of the temple. So the whole thing is surrounded. He gave them weapons that David had accumulated during his reign and that had been being stored in the temple. So they had shields, they had weapons, and he said, I don't want you to just wear your weapons. I want you to have your sword in your hand while you're standing guard. And while they were standing guard, he brought out Ahaziah's son, and I've remembered all the names till this one. Josiah?
I'll say Josiah.
Does that sound right? Josiah?
The one last one.
Okay, we'll say it's Josiah. He brought him out. Josiah is 7 years old. They brought him out. They put the crown on his head. They gave him a copy of the law of Moses, which when Moses wrote his law, he commanded, he said, God doesn't really want you to have a king, but someday you're going to have a king anyway. And when you do, he is to have a copy of the law of Moses. He's supposed to be well versed in that. So they put the crown on his head, they gave him the law of Moses, and then they began shouting, long live the king. And they blew trumpets and they played music, and everybody was very happy to have this 7-year-old child be their king. Athaliah must have been a horrible queen. From the palace, she heard all the commotion, and she ran out of the palace, she ran into the temple, and when she saw Josiah with his crown on his head, she began to scream, treason! So Jehoiada said, you know, it's really wrong to kill people in the church. So take her out of the church and kill her. And if anyone tries to rescue her, kill them too. We don't want this woman around. So she's dead. You get rid of her. And Josiah became a good king as long as Jehoiada was alive. And Jehoiada, thankfully, had a very long life. Josiah was a good king. He killed the main high priest of Baal. And he ruled right. He just was a good king of Judah. So God preserved David's line, just like he promised David. He said, the Messiah will be through your line. You'll have people on the throne. He took care of him. He fulfilled his promises through the whole Athaliah deal. Let's sing our song. Everybody ought to know. Everybody ought to know. Everybody ought to know. Everybody ought to know.